So let's talk about something called the Solomon Doctrine. It's this pretty controversial modern framework, basically a guide to relationships that one author built entirely from just 3 verses in the ancient book of Proverbs. You might be wondering, how in the world do you get a modern dating strategy from a text that's, thousands of years old? Well, let's break it down. Everything we're going to talk about today kicks off with this single line from Proverbs Chapter 5. Right off the bat, it paints this really powerful picture, right? Words as sweet as honeycomb, a voice smoother than oil. You get this image of something that's almost impossible to resist. And that idea of allure is absolutely central to the doctrine's warning.
Okay, before we go any further, I need to make something super clear. This explainer is all about breaking down the doctrine as its author presents it. We're looking at this one specific modern interpretation. We're not doing a new theological study of the scripture itself. Just want to be upfront about that.
All right, so to really get this doctrine, you gotta understand the lingo. The author takes these ancient ideas and gives them some very specific and sometimes very modern definitions.
First up, this term, strange woman. Now, according to the source material we're looking at, the original Hebrew word zuar means to turn aside specifically to commit adultery. So inside this doctrine, strange has nothing to do with being weird or peculiar. It's all about infidelity.
And this is where things get, modern. The author brings in the slang term 304. If you're not familiar, it comes from typing that number on a calculator and then turning it upside down. It's used here as a kind of contemporary shorthand. The logic in the doctrine is that a person who's already justified infidelity in their own life might end up giving you advice that could lead you down that same path. Okay, so the doctrine lays out who to be wary of. Now, let's get into the why. This next part really digs into the consequences, setting up this huge contrast between that sweet initial promise and a really, really grim reality. This slide gets to the heart of the warning. The experience might start out feeling smoother than oil, but the verse warns that its end is bitter as wormwood. The doctrine just hammers this point home. What seems so appealing at first is said to lead to a seriously negative, even poisonous outcome. So what exactly is wormwood? Well, in this doctrine, the source connects it to the Hebrew word la'ana, and the interpretation here is that it's not just bitter. It's actively poisonous and accursed, like hemlock. So the takeaway in this framework is huge. To listen to these words is to willingly drink poison and take on a curse. And believe it or not, the warning gets even more intense from here. The doctrine shifts from the idea of poison to the metaphor of a weapon, really highlighting what it sees as malicious intent behind the words. Then you get this line describing the end as being sharp as a two-edged sword. I mean, what a powerful and violent image, right? It suggests these words don't just lead to bitterness. They are designed to actively cut and wound you. Now, this doctrine has a pretty unique take on what two-edged sword means. The author's thinking goes like this. Because a two-edged sword takes longer to sharpen, it symbolizes plotting and premeditation. From this perspective, the words aren't just accidentally harmful, they're a calculated trap, carefully crafted to bring someone down. And then comes what this doctrine presents as the final, absolute consequence. In this interpretation, there's no gray area. Following this path doesn't just get you into a bit of trouble, it leads directly to death and a hold on hell. It is, without a doubt, the starkest warning in the whole framework. So, after all of those dire warnings, what's the solution? Where do you go from here? Well, the final piece of this doctrine is built on one last verse, which the author presents as both the final word on the problem and the only way out. And here's the first piece of that final verse. The doctrine takes this phrase, "Her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them," and interprets it as a final judgment. The author's conclusion is pretty blunt. Trying to understand a woman's motives is presented as a totally futile, impossible task. Now you might be asking, why would Solomon, the supposed author of Proverbs, make such a sweeping statement? Well, according to this doctrine, the proof is in this number, 1,000. And here's the context for that number. According to Scripture, King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The logic in this doctrine is really straightforward, if a little extreme. The idea is, if a guy with direct experience of 1,000 women concluded their ways are unknowable, what chance does anyone else have? Okay, so if the problem is this unknowable, dangerous trap, what's the solution? Are you just supposed to give up? Is that it? Not according to this doctrine. The author says the answer is actually hiding in plain sight in the very same verse that lays out the problem. The solution, according to the author, is found in the first part of that verse, lest thou shalt ponder the path of life. The doctrine frames this as the key instruction. See, the answer isn't to try and understand the external, unknowable person, but to turn your focus inward. First, you ponder the path. You think about the real consequences and rewards of your decisions. And second, you stay reflective, constantly learning from what you do to avoid making the same mistakes again.
So, when you step back and look at it, what we really unpacked here is how the Solomon Doctrine takes just a handful of ancient verses and builds an entire framework to deal with a very modern social anxiety. And that leaves us with a much bigger question, one for all of us to think about. How do we constantly reinterpret ancient wisdom and warnings to make sense of the challenges and fears we face today? Something to chew on. Thanks for tuning in.